Yeah, I came back and she was like on the couch. I'm like, babe, babe. And I was shaking and her head was going. I'm like, wait. And I gave her a couple of slaps. And then I'm like, oh,
This is Rowan Hansen, and this is Andrew McGann. 2 crimes, 2 killers, and 2 forests that will never feel the same again. In the heart of the Ozarks lies the Devil's Den, a stunning state park with a name that now feels hauntingly accurate. It was here that a family's peaceful camping trip ended in bloodshed at the hands of Andrew McGann, a man with dark fantasies that nobody seemed to know about. Meanwhile, across the world and in Australia's vast wilderness, a peaceful romantic getaway became a nightmare when Rowan Hansen unleashed his rage on the woman that he claimed to love. And it all happened deep in the Bulga Forest and inside a lonely cabin which was known as the Witch's Hut, another name that has since turned out to be chillingly suitable. It is hard to believe that either of these stories are real. However, the woods can indeed be a terrifying place, especially when no one can hear you scream for help. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today I have not 1 but 2 horrifying stories for you. From America to Australia, we're traveling from deep within the Devil's Den to the 4 walls of the Witch's Hut, and as it turns out, both of these terrible crimes happened within state national parks. So I suppose this video is kind of all about being careful when you venture into the woods. By the way, I post videos here weekly, and so if that does sound like your kind of thing, then please do consider subscribing, as it really does help the channel out. And now, with that said, please get comfortable, grab yourself a coffee, and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This first story is the case of Andrew McGann. Welcome to the Devil's Den, folks. Nestled deep in the Ozark Mountains of northwest Arkansas lies a beautiful place called the Devil's Den State Park. Spanning over 2,500 acres of rugged terrain, its trails twist through thick forests, winding caves, and ancient limestone crevices which have stood for centuries. This is the place where wildlife is abundant, the sun filters softly through the canopy, and the air carries that clean, wild scent of summer. And in the winter, temperatures can easily drop below freezing, transforming this place into an icy forest. Now, this place is already remote, but in the winter, it's even more isolating. People often stay indoors for warmth instead. With the darker nights, colder days, and a sense of general lethargy, health does naturally dip over the winter, both physically and mentally. And honestly, it makes sense. Every winter, I seem to catch something, whether it's a cold, fatigue, or just the general feeling that my body's running low on battery. And I have to admit to you, I have definitely done the midnight doom scroll too. And look, I know that you know exactly what I'm talking about here. The one where you're googling slight cough and half an hour later, you're convinced it's the end of the world. You know what I find quite funny? We seem to have mastered using our phones to diagnosing our own doom, but not to actually see a doctor. And so, imagine this instead. Instead of doom scrolling and self-diagnosing, you simply open your phone, find a real and network doctor who's available tomorrow, and they're actually the right fit for you. And that's the magic of this video's sponsor, ZocDoc, because there are no office hours and no delays. It's simply a few clicks and boom, you're all booked, before your head hits that pillow. ZocDoc is a free website where you can easily search, compare, and book high-quality and network doctors, so you can find the one that actually feels right for you. Whether you're looking for someone nearby, in-network, or who has openings soon, ZocDoc helps you find them fast and with no guesswork or phone calls needed. And with more than 100,000 providers across nearly every specialty, ranging from mental health to dentistry, eye care, or skincare, and everything in between, you can also see their appointment times, read verified reviews, and instantly book to a time that suits you. In fact, most happen within 24 to 72 hours, sometimes even the same day. Genuinely, I love ZocDoc's entire concept, and I am so glad to see that some of you have been using it since my last sponsor, because honestly, it just makes adulting a little bit easier. And next time I'm in the US, which by the way will be next year, more on that another time, I will be sure to use ZocDoc when I need a doctor. So stop waiting, stop guessing, and start getting the care that you need. Go to ZocDoc.com/coffeehousecrime and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. Because sure, some mysteries are worth diving into alone, but your health shouldn't be one of them. Now let's get straight back into this video. Now, of course, names can be deceiving, but sometimes they are spot on. And for all of its peace and tranquility, the Devil's Den does in fact unfortunately hold up to its name today, because on a warm July afternoon in 2025, this paradise became the scene of something absolutely horrific. At around 2:40 p.m, hikers walking along one of its trails were startled by the sounds of screams. They reported hearing frantic and desperate cries echoing through the trees, and so, moments later, they called the Arkansas State Police and requested support immediately.
Cover the main trail right now first.
Hear yells calling for help. We're hiking down.
10-4, we're hearing them too towards the end of the lower part of the Devil's Den Trail. Try to relay to the office that we found the victims down here. They're on the lower Devil's Den Trail. I've got two bodies down here.
Park rangers raced towards the area, not yet realizing the horror that was waiting for them nearby. Eventually, they found two young girls who had since found help from nearby hikers. With tears streaked across their faces, they were both terrified and pleading for help. Help to save both their mum and their dad. Because, as it turns out, what began as a simple family day out for them was tragically about to descend into a nightmare. Deep among the trees, park rangers found two young girls just 7 and 9 years old. They were quite visibly shaking, with tears streaked across their face, and they were hardly able to speak about what they'd just experienced only a few minutes prior. They'd been hiking in the woods with their parents when, all of a sudden, something terrible happened. And the thing is, this wasn't the kind of danger that you'd usually expect from the woods either, because this wasn't a bear or a snake, but something far worse. It was human. According to the girls, their family had just been ambushed when, all of a sudden, a stranger with a knife appeared out of nowhere. He first attacked their father, and then that is when all chaos broke loose. Within those frantic moments, their mother made one final selfless act. She pushed both of her daughters away and told them to run. She then turned around and ran back towards the danger, yelling at her daughters one final time to run as far as possible. And so that is precisely what they did. But heartbreakingly, after running for a minute or two, they turned around and neither of their parents had followed. And that is when both of them realized that they were now truly and utterly alone in this big expanse of woodland with a killer on the loose. Somewhere along the rugged trail, the sisters would finally encounter other hikers. Distressed, sobbing, and clearly in shock, they told them that their parents were being attacked. And so, realizing the urgency of the situation, these strangers thankfully led the girls out to safety. After the girls were led out to safety, one of those hikers did something that only few would dare. He turned around and then walked back towards the danger, in a valiant attempt to save their parents. Venturing deeper into the woods, he then stumbled across a scene that would haunt him forever, because soon enough, he found both Clinton and Kristen lying on the ground, brutally stabbed and barely clinging to life. As you probably have guessed, Devil's Den is extraordinarily remote, and in those woods, cell service is basically non-existent. The hiker had no choice but to climb back towards higher ground, in a desperate attempt to try and reach signal and then call for help. However, by the time the authorities were alerted and first responders managed to find Clinton and Kristen, it was tragically all too late. Just half a mile from the nearest trailhead, they found both of them lifeless on the ground, each having suffered multiple stab wounds. It was a scene that was so chaotic and heartbreaking that even seasoned professionals were shocked, and the kind of violence that they witnessed here felt so extraordinarily out of place. Detectives arriving on the scene would later piece together what they believe had happened. It appeared that the attacker had first targeted Clinton, before then turning on Kristen, and due to the defensive wounds found on both of their hands, the two parents had fought back fiercely, clearly in a desperate attempt to try and protect their daughters. Interestingly, they seemed to have found a third set of DNA too, which was probably left behind by the attacker and indicated that he too was likely wounded in the struggle. And although no results came back after running this DNA through both national and state databases, it was still a vital piece of evidence.
We begin tonight with breaking news out of Devil's Den State Park, where Arkansas State Police are investigating a double homicide. A man and a woman were found dead on the trail this afternoon, and tonight a search is underway for their alleged killer. 5 News has confirmed ASP's Criminal Investigation Division is leading the case, and a heavy law enforcement presence remains at the state park as the investigation continues. The suspect in the double homicide is described as a white man of an unknown age, last seen wearing dark-colored shorts, a dark tank top, and weightlifting-type gloves. Witnesses say he was driving toward a park exit at Devil's Den in a black 4-door sedan, possibly a Mazda, with a license plate covered up by duct or electrical tape.
Tragically, both Clinton and Kristen would lose their lives on that trail. Quite simply, their injuries were too severe to survive, and they spent their final moments defending each other and their daughters. Now, I'd like you to put yourself in their shoes for a moment here and think about how terrifying this must have been for them, knowing that your body is giving up and you're probably about to die, but not knowing if your partner and children are safe. I mean, the sheer terror, anger, and heartbreak that both Clinton and Kristen must have experienced in their final moments is absolutely unfathomable. However, and with thanks to their bravery, both of their daughters would not only survive, but also come out of this physically unharmed. As word of the double homicide spread through Arkansas, its citizens were both horrified and furious by the news. I mean, how could anyone do something so horrible to this innocent family? This is the kind of story that comes straight out of a horror movie, but the thing is, this was reality. And of course, 2 haunting questions emerged. Who could have done this, and why? Now, before we get to that question, who precisely were the victims of this senseless attack? Because Clinton and Kristen Brink were not just names in a headline. They were people just like you and me. It turns out that the Brink family had only recently moved to Arkansas, looking for new opportunities and a fresh start for their family. Full of hope and wonder, they had recently settled into the quiet city of Prairie Grove, only a short drive away from Devil's Den. In fact, the family had tragically only just moved here, with their newfound connection with the waters of the Ozarks being barely 2 weeks old. Looking back, it is easy to imagine their excitement for the summer ahead, exploring their new surroundings, taking in the rolling Ozark Hills, and introducing their daughters to the beauty of all the trails nearby. For Clinton and Kristen, Arkansas was supposed to mark the very beginning of a new chapter, not the end of their story. Clinton, who was 43 years old, was a devoted husband and father, and was described by friends as both hardworking and kind. He was only a few days away from starting a new job as a milk delivery driver, with his first day scheduled for the Monday after that fateful weekend. And Kristen, who was 41 years old, was a tender and compassionate nurse, licensed in both Montana and South Dakota, and planning to continue her medical career in Arkansas. Family members described them as inseparable loving parents, who shared an unshakable bond with each other and both of their daughters. They were active in their faith, ready to become involved in their community, and loved spending time outdoors. It is heartbreaking to think that the Arkansas chapter of their lives would end almost as soon as it began. The dreams they carried, settling into a new home, starting new jobs, and watching their daughters grow up, should have been a beautiful time for the family, but instead, they were ripped apart in an instant. In the words of those who knew them best, Clinton and Kristen died as heroes. The outpouring of grief from Prairie Grove and beyond was overwhelming, and friends, neighbors, and even strangers alike all struggled to comprehend how something so cruel and senseless could happen. And so, as the community mourned, investigators turned their focus back to that single urgent question: who was responsible? In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, detectives were faced with the chilling reality that somewhere out there, a killer was in the Ozark wilderness. So, who was their suspected killer? Well, both children described an unknown man, so police knew it was likely a guy. And although evidence at the crime scene was quite limited, investigators found one crucial piece of information. traces of blood that did not belong to either of the victims. Which, to be honest, outside of surveillance footage, is probably the best thing you could find. And then came another lead, because it turns out that one of the hikers on the trail at the time recalled seeing a man urgently walking away from the scene, and he also had blood on his face. The Arkansas State Police quickly mobilized, and within 24 hours, they had a potential photo of their suspect, and detectives had a good gut feeling that this was the actual man they were looking for. This photo, which was taken by an alert hiker, showed a man from behind and standing among the trees with a backpack slung over his shoulders. And although his face wasn't visible, the image offered a glimpse of his build and his clothing. Meanwhile, the composite sketch, which was based off of witness descriptions, depicted a Caucasian male of medium build and ordinary enough to blend into any crowd. However, it was his clothing that stood out. Witnesses described him wearing a long-sleeved shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark pants, a black baseball cap, sunglasses, a black backpack, and notably, fingerless gloves. And interestingly enough, all of these details matched the blood-covered suspect that one of the hikers had seen. That same suspect was then later seen leaving the area in a black four-door sedan, possibly a sporty model, and with its license plate partially covered up with tape, which also sounded extraordinarily suspicious. And of course, when you wrap all of these details together, they describe someone who was prepared, cautious, deliberate, and trying to remain anonymous. As this photo and sketch hit the news, public alarm just basically exploded. The idea that this random killer had struck a family in the middle of a park terrified Arkansas. Rumors spread online like wildfire, and while some believed it was maybe just a robbery gone wrong, others believed it was something far, far darker, like a serial killer who was ready to attack again.
There is a suspect of a homicide that is at large right now. There's a risk to the community in any community they are in.
For 5 long days, Devil's Den State Park remained closed as the authorities worked around the clock to comb through the forest. They also checked every lead and chased every tip they came across. Soon enough, people were calling in from all across the country. Locals, hikers, and even strangers from out of state all weighed in on this guy. In fact, calls even came as far away as Washington state. Meanwhile, several park visitors and nearby residents shared their own surveillance footage from around Devil's Den. And when detectives pieced all of these clips together, they believed that their killer had in fact escaped in a black 2022 Kia Stinger. I mean, not only did it match witness reports perfectly, but it also had half of its license plate taped out, and soon enough, they would indeed have a name. After tracing the vehicle's registration plate and sightings, detectives would soon find themselves 30 miles north from Devil's Den and in the small city of Springdale. And only 5 days after the killings, officers spotted the black Kia parked outside of a local barber shop. Now, if this person really was their killer, then it appeared that he was getting a haircut to try and protect his identity. And speaking of haircuts, we will come back to that again soon. But for now, all you need to know is that the man's name was Andrew McGann. As you can see in this surveillance footage, at 1:18 p.m. on July the 30th, 2025, the black sedan pulled up at the local barber shop, and only a few seconds later, our suspect left the driver's seat. 1 minute later, he is then sitting down at the barber's chair. But this hairdresser wouldn't get very far, because only 12 minutes later, he was then in cuffs with a half-finished haircut. This person seemed to match the suspect description perfectly, because not only did he have the same build and the same look, but as crucially observed by officers, he also had injuries consistent with the fight that had taken place on that trail. And of course, outside on the parking lot was that black Kia Stinger. Now, despite the massive allegations against him, Andrew cooperated with the officers and even allowed them to search his car. When they finally did, they discovered traces of blood inside of the vehicle, and within 24 hours, DNA testing confirmed that the blood found inside his car matched that found at the crime scene. both of which obviously belonging to him. With Andrew's blood found in the vehicle, and both the vehicle and his blood being attached to the crime scene, it made it almost impossible to deny his involvement. Faced with all of this evidence, Andrew even allegedly confessed to the officers, outright admitting to them that he had actually stabbed both Clinton and Kristen to death. And so, with that said, the manhunt was now finally over. However, bigger questions emerged instead. For example, who was Andrew James McCann? What could have driven him to such savagery? And why does his hair look like a packet of dry ramen noodles? Just a heads up here, but remember that Andrew's middle name is James. I'll tell you why later. Now, on the surface, Andrew seemed like an unlikely suspect in this scenario. He was a former school teacher, 28 years old, and well-educated. I mean, ironically, this sounds exactly like the case of Scott Beerley. Andrew also had no criminal record and no documented history of mental illness. He had recently moved to Arkansas after being hired as a teacher by Springdale Public Schools, the same district that covered the Devil's Den area, which technically could have meant that eventually he would have even become the teacher of their daughters. As an additional side note here, he had already passed every background check and was ready to begin teaching that fall. This means that, by all accounts, Andrew was an ordinary educator with teaching certifications in Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. He was literally spotless across the board. No infractions, no suspensions, nothing. However, as the police and reporters alike began to dig deeper, cracks slowly began to show. Former colleagues and parents in Texas remembered Andrew differently. He was known to be awkward, withdrawn, and difficult to connect with. And although he had taught 4th graders at an elementary school in Flower Mound in 2023, things did not end well. Earlier that spring, he was placed on administrative leave following several complaints about his behavior. That included poor classroom management, questionable professional judgment, and what some parents described as favoritism toward certain students. In fact, he even had complaints against him after tickling his students, which yet again sounds eerily similar to the case of Scott Beerley. And so, under growing pressure, Andrew eventually resigned, and rightfully so. But unfortunately, he would then briefly resurface in Oklahoma school, only to resign again in May of 2025. Of course, before then making the decision to move to Arkansas. Looking back at all of this, there were subtle signs of instability, but nothing pointed towards violence. On paper, he was just a teacher, but in reality, he had become something else entirely. With so much evidence against him, Andrew was charged with 2 counts of capital murder, and prosecutors made it clear that they would be seeking the death penalty. And by the way, just to be clear here, he is still yet to have his trial. For now, he is just being held without bond. But I also have to make it clear here that the evidence against him is quite simply overwhelming. I mean, we have his blood at the crime scene, his clothing and his car matching witness reports and surveillance footage, and even a confession he made to officers. I really don't think he's coming back from this one. However, I could be wrong, so let's just watch this space. And as you may have guessed, after lawyering up, Andrew has officially retracted his confession, and has now pleaded not guilty to both counts of capital murder. And of course, this is where the hard part begins, because it might take a few years to find justice, and to make things even more frustrating, the authorities are even considering a gag order. So this might be it for a while. Now, personally, I find gag orders to be extremely frustrating. For example, I really wanted to cover the case of Ali Abulaban, but that order made finding accurate information incredibly difficult. I mean, that's one of the reasons, the other being that it's already way overcooked on YouTube. Another question that remains here is why? Why would a 28-year-old teacher with no criminal record, no known mental illness, and no connection to the victims just suddenly murder a random couple? As of October of 2025, the authorities admit that they still don't know his motive. Investigators are still retracing Andrew's final days and piecing together his movements in hopes of finding a clue. Because, quite simply, Andrew hasn't said anything. Ever since lawyering up, his statements remain sealed, and officials refuse to speculate. Whatever the truth may be, the lack of motive makes this tragedy even more frustrating. 2 loving parents were murdered, and yet nobody can explain why. As one official put it, no family should ever have to endure this, and until the answer to why is found, the shadows of Devil's Den will continue to linger.
we were able to take a monster off the streets and bring relief to Clinton and Kristen's precious girls. And to the rest of the citizens of Arkansas.
We're still exploring and determining exactly what that motive was, so it'd be a little premature for us to speak on that tonight.
What we do know is that Clinton and Kristen died protecting their daughters, giving up both of their lives so that their girls could carry on. Their 2 young daughters are now being raised by their relatives and are surrounded by love as they face a long road of healing. They will grow up remembering their parents' courage and, of course, their unimaginable loss. In the wake of their deaths, the community's response was extraordinary. Vigils filled the night with candlelight and prayer, and fundraisers poured in over $80,000 to support the girls. Friends and strangers alike all rallied behind the family, and it's clear that they have a good support system in motion. And as for Andrew, he still remains in custody while he waits for his trial. And of course, with 2 counts of capital murder under his belt, he could possibly face the death penalty. Again, the evidence against Andrew is quite simply overwhelming, and so I see no reason why not to cover this case where it stands. Of course, we won't know until the verdict is read out, but I think it's quite obvious. And if I'm wrong, well, I'll eat my shoe. Devil's Den State Park has since reopened, but locals say it feels different now. The forest still stands to be both peaceful and beautiful, but others say that it feels haunted. In the end, this case is a brutal reminder that life can change in an instant. And if there's anything else that this story can teach us, is that even in beautiful places, evil can happen. I mean, there's that reason, but also, I had no idea the devil had ramen hair. Right, so our next story takes place in another forest in Australia, and so, on that note, please grab yourself another coffee, because this is the case of Rowan Hansen. Welcome to Australia, folks. Found around 45 miles west of Port Macquarie in New South Wales lies Bulga Forest. Now, as someone who loves rainforests and woodlands, Bulga looks absolutely incredible. It forms part of the Birrawal-Bulga National Park and is covered with rugged foothills, steep ravines and high elevations. Dense eucalyptus trees tower over narrow dirt tracks, and on cloudy days, light will barely filter through the canopy. It is eerily silent here, save for the wind and the distant rush of water through the valleys. Once home to ancient Aboriginal pathways, Bulga Forest is now a patchwork of state forest and protected national park. It is breathtakingly beautiful, yet profoundly isolating all the same, and it's the kind of place where, sometimes, secrets will stay buried forever. As you can see on the satellite image, it is a very dense forest, and includes locations like the Bluff Lookout, Bulga Cemetery, and Blue Knob Lookout. And just a word of advice for anyone thinking about walking in this area, but please don't go telling all of your friends that you spent all afternoon up Blue Knob. They will probably look at you funny, or at least expect that you have some sort of Smurf fetish. It was at 10:45 AM on the morning of September the 18th, 2021, that a harrowing phone call was made to the authorities. The caller pleaded for help in the forest, and it came from a remote location only known as the Witch's Hut, a building that only a select few officers knew about. For reasons unknown, both state police and the media seemed to try to keep this place buried, but through my research, it seems that the Witch's Hut can be found here, placed along Pole Dump Road and near Old Blue Knob Road. The cabin that they called the Witch's Hut was an old logger's outpost, basically a one-room shack with a tin roof and a brick chimney, which had long been abandoned and slowly reclaimed by the bush. Its windows are broken, the wooden walls are covered in graffiti, and the forest was slowly encroaching on it. To many of us, this place feels quite creepy, but to some adventurers and probably other unsavory folk, it was used as a hideaway. The area around the hut was remote and rugged, with towering eucalyptus trees surrounding the clearing, and at nighttime it gets a whole lot worse, as the entire forest is swallowed in darkness. If you don't have a phone or a flashlight, the moon is your only source of light here. There are no facilities, no electricity, and the trees make it difficult to obtain any sort of phone signal. That means that if trouble arises here, you're basically on your own. And of course, to some people, that actually is part of the appeal. It's a chance to disconnect from the world and leave all of your troubles behind. However, in this instance, that one trouble was right there with her. This phone call came from a man named Rowan James Hansen, who dialed 000 and was both frantic and desperate. And when the operator picked up, he simply said, "There's no reviving her." Now, remember I mentioned Andrew's middle name being James? Well, it turns out that Rowan had the same middle name too. Of course, it's just a coincidence, but still, I always find these details to be rather strange. When he said that there was no chance in reviving her, Rowan was talking about his long-term girlfriend named Dee. The two were supposed to be camping that week, but it turns out that it would actually be her last night alive. He claimed that earlier that night, the two were driving down this dirt road around 2 miles away from the cabin when all of a sudden they accidentally crashed, leaving Dee severely injured. He then told the operator that after leaving his girlfriend at the witch's hut, he then sought to find help, only returning later to find that she had passed away from her injuries. In other words, Rowan was presenting himself as this panicked partner who was trying to save his girlfriend in the middle of a forest without any reception. Believing what he was saying, the operator then dispatched both police and paramedics to the scene. However, with this place being so remote, it would take them up to 3 hours to arrive. And let's just say that, by the time they got there, police realized that the story Rowan had created was not quite adding up. When help finally arrived, they walked straight into a haunting scene. Found just outside of the small hut was Dee's body. She was motionless and lying on the ground, and based on the positioning of her body, it appeared as though someone had either carried her or dragged her from inside. Rohan sat weakly on the ground, repeating the same story that he'd told the operator.
Yeah, I came back and she was like on the couch. I'm like, babe. And I was shaking and her head was going. I'm like, wait. And I gave her a couple of slaps. And then I'm like, oh, f***.
He told officers that he and Dee had crashed their car on a nearby track and that her injuries were the results of that crash. He also claimed that he'd left her at the hut to seek help and, upon his return, found that she hadn't survived. It was a desperate story and one full of emotion, and on the surface it even sounded plausible. However, something didn't quite sit right with the officers. As police slowly examined the crime scene, they noticed that details began to clash with Rohan's story. Dee's injuries were, put quite simply, far too extensive and serious for a low-speed crash. And when looking inside of the hut, well, officers realized that signs of violence were everywhere. For example, officers found one of the internal walls to be both splintered and punctured, almost as if someone had been bashed against it multiple times. They also found overturned furniture, evidence of a struggle, and even blood on the sofa. When they looked back at Rohan's story, the investigators simply could not ignore the inconsistencies. They began to treat this site not as a tragic accident, but as a potential crime scene instead. And from that moment onwards, Rohan remained firmly in their sights. And when they started collecting testimonies and statements from close friends and family, well, that made them all the more suspicious. But before we carry on with this story, who precisely were Rohan and Dee? In the quiet riverside town of Wingham, and tucked away on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, lived Rowan Hansen and Dee Ania. They were known as a couple who loved the simple things in life, including campfires, long drives, and weekends lost in the bush. They had been together since 2017, and from the outside looking in, they were inseparable. Rohan was rugged and outdoorsy, while Dee was warm, spirited, and endlessly kind. Family and friends would often see them going on adventures together, usually camping, fishing, and hiking. And Rowan and Dee had a long list of places to stay too, which, as we know, included the witch's hut. To them, this hut was a secret hideaway where they could disappear from the world. And although it technically was a shabby, abandoned old lodge, to them it was a frequent holiday spot where they could drink wine and gaze at the stars in peace together and not worry about anything else in life. However, as we also know, this romantic story and life itself would end with tragedy. And that's because beneath the surface of that love was an uncontrolled darkness. Friends recalled the couple regularly arguing, which was often fueled by shouting and heavy drinking. It was the kind of volatility that made others uneasy, but Dee would often try to brush it off. She was described by her family as a fun sister with a big heart, the sort of person who gave second chances and believed that people could change. But you see, Rowan was different. Those closest to the couple would later tell detectives some very worrying details. Many confirmed that their explosive arguments and drunken fights could often be heard from outside of the home. For example, one neighbor claimed to have heard yelling and even the breaking of furniture, and another friend even claimed to have seen Rowan stomping on her head. Dee's own mother, Caroline, would even once walk in on him punching her daughter in the face, and another time he was seen headbutting her in front of her entire family. As you can tell, this guy is practically a waste of oxygen. And it turns out that these were not isolated bursts of anger either. They seemed to be loud, unmistakable, and routine. However, for whatever reason, she stayed. Whether it was out of love, or fear, or that quiet, desperate hope that one day things might get better, we will never know. But what's clear is that she was in deep trouble. And of course, we then get to September of 2021, when both Rowan and Dee had made plans to return back to the witch's hut. Now, apparently, this was all part of a multi-day camping trip, and they had plans to stay at the witch's hut for one night before then moving on to the next place. And so, before heading out, they loaded up the truck with food, firewood, supplies, and a few beers for good measure. However, that wouldn't last them the night, and so they would buy more along the way. In fact, on the evening before her death, Dee was spotted on the surveillance camera of a nearby servo. She was seen walking through the store and then into the alcohol fridge. While here, she picked up a crate of beer before then walking out and paying. She can then be seen handing the crate of beer to Rowan before then returning to the vehicle. Nothing really seemed to stand out from this footage. I mean, they may have acted a little distant to one another, but maybe they were just idly getting on with their tasks. They then drove west and deep into New South Wales, and around 2.5 hours later, they eventually made it to the witch's hut. And the plan that they had that evening was actually quite simple. They wanted to set up camp, put some music on, and then drink beers under the stars. Of course, without any reception or anyone bothering them. However, what actually happened that night and over the next 12 hours still remains a mystery, because by morning, Dee was dead. In the hours after her discovery, Rowan still clinged to his story. He described the accident over and over again to officers, and it was always the same thing. That he lost control at the wheel, the car crashed, Dee was injured, and then somehow, after making it back to the hut, she passed away. In an effort to try and add weight to his story, he then told the officers where they could find his crashed vehicle, which was only a few miles away from the hut. And after investigating, they realized that his truck had a few dents and a broken light, which, of course, was enough to suggest a minor crash. So maybe it did happen, or maybe perhaps it was staged. When detectives started to piece things together, they realized that things did not quite add up. For example, if this was really a car accident, then why didn't he drive the truck straight into town? It wasn't that damaged after all. And even if that was not an option, then why not call for help from the nearest farmhouse? Why, out of all of the options available, would you then decide to return to an isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere? Many of his decisions quite simply made no sense to them. However, the most troubling of all of these details were actually Dee's injuries, because they were far too severe for the kind of collision that Rowan had described. Things just didn't quite sit right, and the police were beginning to wonder if there was no accident at all. Within 3 days, everything began to fall apart, and on September the 21st of 2021, the police formally arrested Rowan on suspicion of murder. Confronted with mounting evidence, he caved under the pressure, and in the interrogation room, he finally admitted that his story was false. He abandoned his former story altogether and instead opted for a different one, this time confessing that an argument had in fact erupted but his girlfriend's injuries were in fact all as a result of him defending himself. According to Rowan, Dee had apparently attacked him first, after she struck him over the head with a beer bottle. He also claimed that apparently he reacted instinctively, tackling her into a wall in self-defense. And when she hit her head, he said that was allegedly what killed her. However, detectives were still not buying it because, put quite simply, Rowan's story had changed too often and too quickly. To begin with, he had simply found Dee dead. Next it was a car crash, and then finally, it was a fight that he hadn't started. These shifting stories made it impossible to believe a word. I mean, Rowan was quite clearly having no issues in lying to the police, or hitting his girlfriend for that matter. And even this new so-called confession didn't make much sense either, because it didn't match the evidence left behind. I mean, Dee had so many injuries, and some of them being so severe, that this really could not have been self-defense. And so, on that note, let's take a look at the evidence that was left behind. The autopsy concluded that Dee had died from blunt force trauma to the head, placing her time of death at around midnight, which was roughly 11 hours before Rowan made his call to emergency services. The medical evidence which was left behind left no doubt that Dee had suffered a long and brutal assault. Her skull was not the only thing that was fractured, it was also her ribs, jaw, and nose. She also received blows to the chest which were so heavy that her lungs were torn, and bruises were found all over her neck, which were consistent with strangulation. In total, the coroner documented over 100 separate injuries. And I want you to think about that for a moment. 100. All of these injuries included bruises, cuts, and abrasions, which all covered her from head to toe. This was no simple scuffle that Rowan was trying to claim it to be, and neither was it a moment of moderate violence either, because this was extraordinarily brutal. The scene inside the witch's hut told the same story. Bloodstains marked the walls and floor, and there was broken furniture, scattered belongings, and multiple holes smashed through the plasterboard. Meanwhile, Rowan's so-called car crash had already fallen apart under scrutiny. There were no skid marks, no crash debris, and no blood inside of the vehicle. And even the dent and broken light seemed staged. Once again, the evidence that was left behind was quite simply overwhelming. It is clear that Dee did not die in an accident. She'd been beaten to death by her partner. The next question that followed was, why? Was this some sort of premeditated killing, or was it drunken rage that spiraled out of control? Well, sadly, finding the answer to that question would unfortunately take some time, as would justice, because as it turns out, Rowan would go through not one, but 2 trials. His first trial would commence in April of 2024, which was 2.5 years after Dee was murdered. But despite this and several days of deliberation, the jury could not make their mind up, and so they ended in a hung verdict. Which in legal terms basically means we gave it a go, but commitment isn't really our thing. Seriously though, apparently, even with 100 bruises, a fractured skull, and a fake car crash, some of the jury still believed that maybe she could have slipped. 1 year later, and in July of 2025, Rowan faced a new jury. This time, there was no confusion, and after 8 days of testimony, they returned with a verdict. On July the 16th, 2025, Rowan James Hansen was found guilty of murdering Dee Anea. The judge called Rowan's attack frenzied and brutal, and cruel and inexplicable. He told the court that Dee had done nothing to provoke her death. She was simply smaller, weaker, and isolated. In short, it was the ultimate nightmare for a victim of domestic violence. Throughout the trial and even in his verdict, the judge acknowledged that Rowan had endured a very traumatic childhood, which was marked by violence, physical abuse, and addiction. But while that history might explain his anger, it can never excuse it. It is worth highlighting though, as bad childhood does seem to be a frequent correlation in my videos. Eventually, Rowan was sentenced to 28 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 17 years. It means that he won't be eligible for release until September of 2042, which by then he'll be in his late 50s. Outside of the courtroom, Dee's family tried to speak through tears. They described her as beautiful, caring, and full of life, and they still miss her every day. Even with the verdict delivered, some questions about that night in Bulga Forest still remain unanswered. For example, what truly sparked the violence? Was it jealousy, or drunken rage, or something more trivial? Rowan has never given a clear explanation for why he lost control, and being honest, I don't think he ever will. In the end, the witch's hut seems to be keeping its secret. We know the outline of what happened, but we don't quite know the intricate details. All we know is that this was a violent man who killed the woman that he claimed to have loved. But the reasons why he murdered Dee seem to be buried in Rowan's mind, and the grim nickname that they had given this cabin turned out to be chillingly suitable. Whatever happened in there, it seems that something dark was conjured within the witch's hut. Not by magic, but by the all too human emotion of rage. This story honestly gave me the chills, not just for the brutality of what happened inside that cabin, but how quickly his love turned to something more terrifying. And those are the stories of Andrew James McGann and Rowan James Hansen, and I still find it really weird that they share the same middle name. You know, there is something beautiful about forests, however, they seem to hold both beauty and terror all the same. So the next time you go out venturing, make sure to keep yourself safe. But yeah, what are your thoughts about this case? To begin with, what do you think really happened in that cabin? And do you think that James will be found guilty? Do you think he deserves the death penalty? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks again to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video. Go to ZocDoc.com/coffeehousecrime to book an in-network top-rated doctor today. And on that note, I'm done here today, folks, so I'll see you again very soon for another video. If you haven't checked out the Coffeehouse Crime podcast yet, then please have a look on Spotify. Otherwise, I'd really appreciate a like on this video, and if you can, subscribe too. As always, folks, thank you so much for being here, I really do appreciate it. And yeah, I'll see you again next week, same time. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourselves and each other. Oh, and stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.